formal relationship, not the same as I had with my son, or I would expect my son to have with his children. But after dinner, we went through the points in the story. And one of them was about centralism, that there was too much centralism in Europe. He said, no, we're a very decentralist society. We don't have that kind of centralism. You're just wrong. And I said, well, you know, he's my father. I'm not going to argue with him too long. Let's go on to the next point. And the next point was about the absence of risk capital in the banking sector. This is, mind you, 12 years ago. And he said, no, my friends in Brussels have lots of money that they put into high-risk ventures and startups and so on. I knew he was wrong, and I said, okay, let's go on to the next point. Well, the whole thing went on like this until we got to the last point. The last point was that Europeans didn't listen to their young. And he said, well, why should we? And of course, we both got a good laugh, but it's a very serious point. America is a part of the world where we do listen to our young better than other parts of the world. And it's something we should do better and better. And the last, of course, being risk-prone, I'll use another story. Sorry to keep telling you stories, but again, another personal story. In this case, it was my mother. And she, at the very end of her life, she was quite elderly and didn't really understand what my son was doing, which was at the time starting a company in Italy. Now, to start a company is challenging, but to do it in Italy is really challenging. And I watched him start the company and watched him take a month to do what a kid in the United States could do in a day. Just everything, from notaries, paperwork, and other things. And the system was not well greased, if you will, for that kind of entrepreneurship, but I encouraged him to do it. And at Christmas time, since my mother had a place in a ski resort in Switzerland, we would all visit. And what she did was she had breakfast in the dining room and would stay there while people sequentially got up and sort of had breakfast at various times and went out to ski. She would be there the entire time to see and talk to everybody when they got up for breakfast. And my son was always the first to get to the mountain early, and so she would have breakfast with him each morning, and I was invariably the last and would have breakfast late. And each morning, he would go tell her about the company he was starting in Italy. And she didn't really understand it. She just adored her grandson and just adored sort of hearing him and sort of what he was doing. She didn't really register until about the third or fourth morning. I arrived at breakfast, and there's a very unhappy lady, very unhappy. And I say, what's wrong? And she said, well, I now understand what Dimitri does. He's unemployed. And she was deeply concerned that he wasn't employed, there wasn't an employer, he was taking too much risk, and what would he do, and he might lose the money, and then so on and so forth. And it was a point of view that, again, was very European at the time. And, of course, the company did fail, and he did lose the money, and none of that mattered. It was the best learning experience he could have had and made him a far more attractive entrepreneur in what he did, which, in fact, was something non-profit that became literally the beginning of one laptop per child. So, sorry, let me continue. So, I don't want to dwell on each one of these, but these are all examples, in my opinion, of where innovation is starting to have a huge impact, really big changes in the IT sector. If I had stood here in front of you 15 years ago and said to you, ladies and gentlemen, the way to make the world's best reference book is for us all to get together and write little silly articles about things we know about and stick it out on the computer, you would have laughed me off the stage. You would have said, this guy is nuts. And yet today, I bet each one of you, when you do a search, half the times a Wikipedia entry comes up as one of the top 3 or 4 entries in your search. And that is complete and unequivocal evidence to me that open source works. And it not only works, it's in fact better really, yes, you can find errors, and yes, there are mistakes, so on, but it over time gets better and better and better and more thorough. And then you say, well, wait a second, how does this really work? There are volunteers out there, and people can abuse it, they can go in and change things, so on and so on. Yes, that's all true, but it still shows us that collectively we can, as a society, do better than any one company or individual or specific collection of scholars. Now, do I want to have my brain surgeon done collectively by people in this room? No. Do I want you to collectively fly the airplane that I'll use to go back to the United States? No, not necessarily. But the point is that there are lots of things where we can collectively do, I call it open source because it applies to content and programs, which really is changing the landscape. Telecommunications is undergoing a very similar change. And those of you who have looked at some of the things that are happening with so-called mesh networks, it's a very profound change. I don't want to take too much time describing the technical nature of it, but it's a big one. Obesity in software, I don't know if it's been as remarkable to you as it is to me, but my laptop today, and I don't mean my $100 laptop, I mean my $2,000 or $3,000 laptop, is slower, less reliable than it was 5 years ago, where it was slower and less reliable than it was 5 years before that. And what's happening is it's now a battle to turn it on, it's a battle to turn it off, it crashes, it does all these things, and you say, why? And the answer is really simple. The answer is that the electronics industry, in its DNA, has a feature that says, very simply, that every 18 months, it'll cost half to make the electronics portion, the circuit portion. Now imagine you're in a business where what you make, your fundamental product, if it's grain, it's grain, if it's steel, and here it's electronics. And I can tell you that the cost of that will drop 50% every 18 months. That's not an amusing business to be in. So what do you do? And this is not ill will. If you're in the cell phone business, you do this. If you're in the laptop business, you do this. If you're in electronics in general, you do it. If you make alarm clocks, you do it. If you make radios, you do it. You add features. And you add features, let me take the cell phone, you add features so that 18 months from now, even though it costs approximately half, I will have so many more features you will be willing to, in fact, pay the same, at least, maybe a little more than you paid for the last time you bought a cell phone. Well, in that world, everything becomes an SUV. Everything becomes a gas guzzler where you're using more petrol to move the car than to move the person, because you keep adding features on top of features. Now, many of them are very valuable features, but many of them are not. And what happens is you get to a state of obesity, and what I call featureitis, where in fact it becomes unstable, and there's an expression in English that says the fat lady can't sing. And this is really a case of that, and we have to look at putting a lot of our electronics on a diet. It was a very convenient time to think of one laptop per child, because part of the solution is the diet, not all of it. And then the fourth almost goes without saying. So I'm going to now, in the context of those remarks, and excuse me if they were long-winded, talk a little bit about one laptop per child, and really describe it. I said it goes back to '68. The first time we did computers in primary education in developing countries was in 1980. And in 1980, OPEC at the time decided they would fund a project that was in fact conceived and run by the French.